Is that real? The question was voiced with a lazy, alcohol-slicked drawl, but I felt the physical violation before the words fully registered. I was standing near a marble pillar in the gold-leafed foyer of the hotel, balancing a silver tray of empty crystal flutes. I was supposed to be a ghost, a silent, efficient delivery system for luxury. But then I felt the sudden, invasive weight of fingers threading into the back of my head. Cauldron Voss didn't just brush against me. He anchored his hand into my hair. I felt the sharp tug at my scalp as he twisted his fist slightly, a casual display of ownership that forced my chin upward. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart," he said, leaning in. His breath smelled of expensive bourbon and arrogance. I asked if this was all yours, or if you bought it from the same place you rented that dress. Before we continue, like this video, if you've ever felt invisible in a world that only sees credentials and titles, share it with someone who needs to hear that courage doesn't require permission. And subscribe, so you don't miss what happens when one temp worker sees the truth everyone else is paid to ignore. Now let's continue. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was a fill-in, a temporary catering worker in a borrowed gown, trying to earn enough to buy a bus ticket out of California and never look back. I wasn't part of this world of real estate magnates and foreign investors. I was the help, and in Cauldron Voss's world, the help didn't have boundaries. "Please let go, Mr. Voss," I whispered. My voice was steady, but my hands were beginning to tremble, the tray in my left hand rattling against my palm. "You're making a scene." Cauldron let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed off the Art Deco ceiling. He looked around at his circle of associates, men in $5,000 suits, and women draped in diamonds. "Did you hear that? She thinks I'm making a scene. I'm just appreciating the craftsmanship." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. It wasn't a malicious roar, it was worse. It was a polite, dismissive titter. A woman in a shimmering silk gown nearby caught my eye, then immediately looked back at her champagne, adjusting her earring as if I were nothing more than a flickering light bulb that needed replacing. A man in a tuxedo checked his watch. The collective apathy of the room formed a wall more impenetrable than any physical barrier. To them, this wasn't an assault. It was a momentarily amusing distraction before the next course was served. "Let go," I said again, louder this time. I tried to pull away, but Cauldron's grip tightened, his knuckles grazing the nape of my neck. The pain shot through my scalp, hot and jagged. He leaned closer, his grin turning into something sharper, something more predatory. "You've got a lot of spirit for someone holding a tray," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Maybe you need to be reminded where you are, and who I am." He began to pull me toward the shadowed corridor leading to the balcony doors, his fist still knotted in my hair. I dug my heels into the plush carpet, my knees buckling. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the pain. 50 people were watching a man drag me across a room, and the music didn't even skip a beat. Then, the air in the room seemed to change. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden heavy shift in the atmosphere, the kind of pressure drop that precedes a massive storm. Across the room, at a small high-top table removed from the main throng, a man stood up. He had been sitting there all night, a silent observer in a sea of noise. His name was Jin-woo, though few in the room truly knew what that name meant. He was tall, with a controlled, athletic build, and dark hair kept in a meticulous, short cut. His suit was dark, tailored with a precision that made Cauldron's expensive clothes look like rags. Until this second, he had been a ghost, the kind of man others instinctively deferred to without ever knowing why. Hale didn't shout. He didn't rush forward with the clumsy bravado of a hero in a movie. He simply pushed his chair back. The sound of the wood legs on the floor was like a gunshot in the suddenly cooling room. He began to walk toward us. His footsteps were measured, calm, and terrifyingly deliberate. As he approached, the laughter in the room died mid-breath. People who hadn't noticed my struggles suddenly found themselves unable to look at anything else. Cauldron didn't see him at first. He was too busy enjoying the terror in my eyes. "You think you're invisible here?" Cauldron sneered, jerking my head back again. "You're only what I say you are. That's enough." The voice was low, resonant, and carried a weight of authority that made the back of my neck go cold. Cauldron froze. I felt his grip falter, the fingers in my hair loosening just a fraction. He turned his head, still holding on to me, to see Jin-woo standing 3 feet away. Hale's expression wasn't angry. It was something far worse. It was empty. He looked at Cauldron as if he were a minor clerical error that needed to be corrected. "Who the hell are you?" Cauldron snapped, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain his big man persona. "This doesn't concern you. Get lost." Hale didn't respond with words. Instead, his gaze dropped to Cauldron's hand, which was still twisted into my hair. Then, slowly, with a terrifyingly fluid motion, Hale reached for the front of his jacket. He unbuttoned it. The action was simple, but the message was a physical blow. By unbuttoning the jacket, he was signaling the end of his restraint. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He didn't need one. The act itself was a ritual, the stripping away of the civil mask to reveal the predator beneath. It was the signal that the business part of the evening was over, and the consequence part had begun. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the catering staff in the distance stopped moving. Security guards at the perimeter of the room subtly adjusted their stances, their eyes fixed on Hale, waiting for a command that didn't need to be spoken. Cauldron's face went from flushed red to a sickly, translucent gray. He looked at Hale's hands, then at his eyes, and finally realized that he had broken a rule he didn't even know existed. He wasn't just dealing with a guest. He was standing in the presence of the man who actually owned the ground he was standing on. I was just... Cauldron stammered, his hand finally dropping away from my head, as if my hair had turned into white-hot wire. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hand instinctively flying to my scalp to soothe the burn. The silver tray slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the floor with a sound that felt loud enough to shatter the windows. Hale didn't look at the tray. He didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes locked on Cauldron Voss. "Leave," Hale said. It wasn't a suggestion. Cauldron tried to find his voice, tried to look around the room for an ally, but he found none. The same people who had been laughing with him 30 seconds ago were now staring at their shoes, or suddenly fascinated by the wallpaper. He was a dead man walking, socially and professionally, and he knew it. Without another word, he turned and practically ran toward the exit, his polished shoes skidding on the marble. The room remained frozen. I stood there, trembling, the borrowed dress feeling like lead against my skin. I waited for Hale to say something to the crowd, to offer a platitude, or to walk away. Instead, he turned toward me. For the first time, the calculation in his eyes softened, replaced by a terrifyingly focused interest. He didn't reach out to touch me. He seemed to respect the fact that I'd had enough of that for one night. He simply looked at me, acknowledging my existence with a gravity I wasn't prepared for. "Are you hurt?" he asked. I'm fine," I managed to choke out, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Hale nodded once. He didn't rebutton his jacket. He left it open, a standing threat to anyone else in the room who might think of following Cauldron's example. He gestured toward a side door, away from the prying eyes of the elite. "Come with me, Ryla," he said. My heart stopped. I hadn't told anyone my name. I was just a fill-in on a list. But as he turned to lead the way, I realized that in this room of shadows and secrets, Hale Jin-woo was the only one who had been truly paying attention. And as I followed him, I knew that the life I was trying to run away from had just been replaced by something much larger and much more dangerous. Chapter 1. The gold-leafed ceiling of the Palm Springs Hotel usually acted as a mirror for the vanity of the men inside it, but tonight, it only reflected the jagged edges of a nightmare. Cauldron Voss's hand was a heavy, sweating anchor in the center of my scalp. The pain was a sharp, focused heat that radiated from my roots down to my jawline. I was bent at a grotesque angle, my borrowed silk dress bunching at the waist as he yanked me backward. "Is it real?" he had asked, a question that sounded more like a threat. When I didn't answer fast enough, the curiosity turned into a demonstration of ownership. Around us, the gala continued in a blur of shimmering fabrics and the clinking of ice against crystal. I saw a real estate mogul I'd served earlier look directly at my watering eyes, then pivot his shoulder to hide the view, returning to a conversation about offshore dividends. Their apathy was a physical wall, a collective agreement that the girl in the service uniform was an object, and Cauldron Voss was a man of consequence. "You think you're invisible here?" Cauldron hissed, his face inches from mine. "You're only what I say you are. And right now, you're a lesson." He began to drag me. My heels skidded across the polished floor, the friction a dull roar in my ears. I reached up, my fingers clawing at his iron-tight wrist, but it was like trying to break stone. The humiliation was a cold poison in my throat. I was being treated like a broken piece of furniture in a room full of people who prided themselves on their humanity, yet not one of them reached out. Then, the air in the room didn't just go cold, it went still. It started at the far end of the bar, a ripple of silence that moved faster than a physical sound. Conversations died mid-sentence. The laughter of a group of foreign investors vanished, as if someone had cut their throats. The atmosphere shifted from the frantic energy of a party to the heavy, oppressive pressure that precedes a desert lightning strike. Hale Jin-woo stood up. He hadn't been part of the noise. He had been a shadow in a tailored suit, a man whose presence was felt rather than seen, sitting in a corner booth with a glass of water he hadn't touched. He didn't shout. He didn't issue a heroic challenge. He simply rose from his chair, his tall, controlled frame unfolding with a predatory grace that made everyone else in the room look small. Cauldron didn't notice at first. He was too drunk on his own perceived power, his fists tightening for another jerk of my hair. Look at me when I... The words died in Cauldron's throat as Hale began to walk. Hale's footsteps were rhythmic and heavy, the sound of a countdown. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He moved with the absolute certainty of a man who knew that once he started moving, the outcome was already decided. As he approached, the crowd parted like water before a blade. Security guards, men who had ignored Cauldron's assault with practiced boredom, suddenly stood at rigid attention, their eyes fixed on the floor. Hale stopped 3 feet away. His expression was a void. No anger, no heat, just a terrifyingly calm calculation. He looked at Cauldron's hand knotted in my hair, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw a flash of something ancient and lethal in his dark eyes. "Who the hell are you?" Cauldron barked, though his voice had jumped an octave. He tried to puff out his chest, but he didn't let go of me. He used me as a shield, a pathetic attempt to maintain his high ground. "This is private business. Get lost before I have you thrown out." Hale didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence he brought with him was more deafening than any threat. Slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing precision, Hale reached for the front of his jacket. His fingers, long and steady, found the top button. He unbuttoned it. The room seemed to inhale. It was a simple gesture, an adjustment of clothing, but in the unspoken language of the men who actually ran this city, it was the sound of a hammer being cocked. By unbuttoning the jacket, Hale was signaling that the time for restraint had passed. He was preparing for the physical reality of a problem that words could no longer solve. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was the weapon. Cauldron's face went from a flushed, arrogant red to a sickly, translucent white. He looked at Hale's open jacket, then back at his eyes, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't looking at a guest. He was looking at the apex predator of the Palm Springs underground, a man whose transnational network was the silent engine behind the very wealth Cauldron loved to flaunt. Cauldron's fingers began to shake. He released my hair so abruptly I stumbled forward, my knees hitting the marble with a dull thud. I scrambled away on my hands and knees, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps, but I couldn't take my eyes off Hale. Hale didn't look at me. Not yet. He kept his gaze locked on Cauldron, who was now trembling so violently his cufflinks rattled. I didn't know," Cauldron stammered, his bravado collapsing into a pile of pathetic excuses. I was just joking around, Hale. We're all friends here, right?" The silence remained. Hale didn't blink. He stood there with his jacket open, a silent judge presiding over a man who had already been found guilty. The message was landing with every second that passed. The room no longer belongs to you. Your status is gone. You are nothing. Finally, Hale spoke. His voice was a low, melodic vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards themselves. "Leave." It wasn't a command. It was a mercy. Cauldron didn't wait for a second invitation. He turned and fled, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the floor as he scrambled toward the exit. He didn't look back at his friends. He didn't look back at the room. He ran as if the shadows themselves were reaching for him. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind Cauldron, the gala remained in a state of suspended animation. No one moved. No one dared to resume their champagne or their gossip. The hierarchy had been reset, and at the center of the new world stood Hale Jin-woo. He finally turned his head. His eyes found me, still huddled on the floor near the marble pillar. The lethality didn't vanish, but it shifted, turning into a focused, intense curiosity. "Ryla," he said. My name felt like a brand. I hadn't told anyone my name tonight. I was a ghost, a fill-in from a temporary agency, a face that was supposed to blend into the wallpaper. But as Hale reached out a hand to help me up, I realized that I had never been invisible to him. "The night is over for you," he said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "You're coming with me." I looked at his hand, then at his unbuttoned jacket, and finally at the room full of elite brokers who were now watching me with a mix of fear and envy. I realized then that while I had been saved from one predator, I had just been claimed by the man who owned the forest. I reached out and took his hand. Chapter 2. The heavy oak doors hadn't even finished vibrating from the force of Cauldron's exit before the silence in the ballroom shifted. It wasn't the respectful silence of a funeral anymore. It was the predatory stillness of a forest after the lightning has struck, but before the fire begins to spread. I remained on the floor for a heartbeat longer than necessary, my palms pressed into the cold marble, feeling the frantic thrum of my own pulse. My scalp felt raw, as if the air itself was too abrasive for the skin where Cauldron's fingers had been. I looked at the silver tray lying inches away, 3 crystal flutes shattered, the expensive champagne soaking into the edge of a Persian rug. That spill was probably worth more than my weekly paycheck, But as I looked up at the circle of elite guests, I realized no one was thinking about the bill. Cauldron had tried to laugh. Just before he turned to run, there had been one last, desperate attempt to reclaim the room. It was a high, wheezing sound that had died in the vacuum of Hale Jinro's gaze. Now that laughter seemed to haunt the space like a bad smell. I saw the friends Cauldron had arrived with, men who had been clapping him on the back only minutes ago. They were moving now, but not toward the exit to check on him. They were moving away from his ghost. One man, a developer who had been nodding along to Cauldron's jokes, suddenly found an intense interest in a painting on the far wall. Another turned his back entirely, flagging down a different server with a frantic, shaking hand, desperate to project the image of a man who had seen nothing, heard nothing, and certainly knew no one named Cauldron Voss. The distancing was surgical. It was the quiet, brutal social execution that happens in rooms like this. Cauldron hadn't just lost a fight, he had been erased from the ledger of the living. Hale Jinro hadn't moved an inch. He stood with his jacket still unbuttoned, his hands hanging relaxed at his sides, though the energy coming off him was anything but peaceful. He was watching the room finish the job he had started. He watched the way the friends and the investors retreated, their eyes darting to him to see if their proximity to the fallen man had tainted them. Then, Hale's eyes dropped to me. The weight of his attention was almost as heavy as Cauldron's grip, but it didn't burn. It was cool, steady, and terrifyingly observant. He didn't offer a hand this time. He simply waited for me to find my own feet. It was a silent demand for me to reclaim my dignity. I stood, smoothing the borrowed silk of my dress, my fingers trembling as I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. I felt the gaze of 50 pairs of eyes on me, eyes that had watched me be dragged and ignored me, but were now wide with a new frantic curiosity. They weren't looking at me as the help anymore. They were looking at me as the woman for whom Hale Jinro had unbuttoned his jacket. "The spill," I whispered, my voice cracking. I looked down at the broken glass, the habit of service, dying hard. I should clean this. "Leave it," Hale said. The two words were a command that rippled through the ballroom, causing the catering manager, who had been hiding behind a pillar, to suddenly sprint forward with a cleaning cloth, his face pale with terror. Hale didn't look at the manager. He stepped closer to me, ignoring the collective gasp that seemed to skip through the room. "You don't belong to the staff tonight, Ryla. You haven't for a long time." "I don't understand," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. "You know my name. You acted like you were waiting for him to do that." Hale's mouth didn't move into a smile, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "I was waiting to see who in this room still thought they could touch what isn't theirs." Cauldron was simply the first to prove he was a fool. He turned slightly, his open jacket revealing the flawless line of his shirt, a subtle reminder of the power he had just unleashed. A few feet away, one of Cauldron's closest business partners made the mistake of trying to catch Hale's eye, perhaps hoping for a nod of approval, a sign that he was still in the inner circle. Hale's gaze swept over the man with the chilling indifference of a winter wind. The man flinched, his glass of scotch wobbling in his hand, and he quickly retreated into the shadows of the bar. The message was clear. There were no survivors in Cauldron's wake. "The party is over for them," Hale said, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. "But for you, it is just beginning. There are people in this city who think they own the air you breathe, because they have a name on a building. They are about to find out that the air belongs to me." I looked around the room one last time. The elite, the magnates, the brokers, they all looked like ghosts. The gold-leafed ceiling and the crystal chandeliers felt like the ribcage of a dying beast. I had come here to earn enough to run away, to hide in the corners of a world that didn't care if I lived or died. But as Hale Jinro stood there, his presence filling the vacuum left by Cauldron's cowardice, I realized there was no running from a man like him. He hadn't just saved me, he had marked me, and the silence of the room told me that everyone else knew it too. "Come," Hale said, gesturing toward the grand staircase. I didn't look back at the broken glass or the people who had watched me suffer. I walked beside him, my head held high, feeling the shift in the world. The apathy was gone, replaced by a sharp, jagged fear that followed us out of the room. Cauldron Voss was a memory, and I was the new reality. Chapter 3. The hallway leading away from the grand ballroom was lined with velvet wallpaper, the color of dried blood, absorbing the distant, frantic hum of the party we had just decapitated. Every step I took away from the marble foyer felt like stepping out of a pressurized cabin. My scalp still throbbed with a rhythmic, pulsing heat, a physical ghost of Cauldron's grip, but the silence out here was heavy in a different way. Hale Jinro walked half a step ahead of me. He still hadn't rebuttoned his jacket. It flared slightly with his stride, revealing the dark silk lining and the impeccable fit of his waistcoat. He didn't look back to see if I was following. He didn't need to. The gravity of what had just happened pulled me along in his wake like a moon caught in a planet's orbit. He stopped at a pair of heavy, unmarked double doors at the end of the gallery. He opened them and waited, his hand resting on the brass handle with a terrifying kind of stillness. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing back at the bright, terrifying world of the gala, before I stepped into the room. It was a private library, smelling of old paper, cedarwood, and a faint, sharp scent that reminded me of ozone before a storm. The light was dim, provided by amber lamps that cast long, steady shadows across rows of leather-bound books. Hale closed the doors, and the last vibration of the ballroom vanished. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a suggestion, but it wasn't a barked command either. It was the way a man speaks, when he assumes the world will rearrange itself to suit his needs. I sat in a wingback chair that felt too large, my borrowed dress rustling like dry leaves. I gripped the armrests until my knuckles turned white. I expected him to ask if I needed water. I expected him to offer a clumsy apology for what Cauldron had done, or perhaps play the role of the knight who had arrived just in time. Hale did none of those things. He walked over to a side table, poured 2 inches of amber liquid into a heavy glass, and leaned against the edge of a mahogany desk. He didn't hand the drink to me. He took a slow, methodical sip and watched me over the rim of the crystal. "You're wondering why I'm not asking if you're okay," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the quiet room. "The thought crossed my mind," I managed to say. My voice was thin, but I refused to let it shake. "If you weren't okay, you wouldn't have stood up the way you did. You would have stayed on the floor, waiting for someone to lift you. You didn't. You reclaimed your own space before I even reached you. I don't waste time asking questions when I already have the answer." He set the glass down with a soft clink. Cauldron Voss is a loud man who believes his bank account is a suit of armor. He spent a decade touching things that don't belong to him, because no one ever told him the price of admission. Tonight he paid it. "Why did you do it?" I asked, looking up at him. The amber light caught the sharp line of his jaw and the absolute lack of doubt in his eyes. "You don't know me. I'm a temporary hire. I'm a ghost in a dress I don't own." Hale straightened up, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the rows of books. "I've been watching you since you walked through the service entrance at 6 o'clock, Ryla. I saw the way you handled the woman at table 4, who spilled her wine, and tried to blame your tray. I saw the way you moved through a room, like someone who is trying to be invisible, but has too much presence to succeed." He walked toward me, stopping just outside my personal space. The air around him felt charged, a static tension that made the fine hairs on my arm stand up. "I didn't step in to be your savior," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I stepped in because I don't like waste. And watching a man like Cauldron attempt to break a woman like you is a waste of potential. I don't care about your resume, or your borrowed dress. I care about the fact that when he had his hand in your hair, you didn't look for a hero. You looked for a way to survive." I felt a strange, cold shiver pass through me. It wasn't fear, at least, not the kind of fear Cauldron had inspired. This was the fear of being seen too clearly. "I'm trying to leave California," I confessed, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I was saving for a ticket. I just wanted to go back to being a ghost somewhere else." "You can't go back to being a ghost," Hale said. He reached out, and for a second I thought he would touch my face, but his hands stopped just short, his fingers hovering near the air by my temple. "Not after tonight. Every person in that ballroom saw me unbutton my jacket for you. In their world, that makes you a person of interest. In my world, it makes you a line in the sand." He stepped back, his shadow stretching across the floor. "The ticket you were saving for, forget it. You're not running. Running is for people who have something to lose. From this moment on, you have everything to gain, provided you understand the nature of this invitation." "What invitation?" I asked, my heart hammering. "I am expanding my logistics network in the valley. I need people who are observant, people who understand that silence is a currency, and people who don't freeze when the room goes dark. I didn't save you tonight, Ryla. I recruited you." He walked back to the desk and picked up a small black card with nothing but a gold-embossed emblem on the front, a stylized knot. He held it out to me. "This isn't a job offer from a catering agency," Hale said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "This is an introduction to the way the world actually works. You can take the card and walk out the back exit. I'll have a car take you wherever you want to go, and you can try to find that bus ticket. But Cauldron's friends will remember your face. They'll wonder why Hale Jinro stood up for a server, and they'll come looking for the answer." He let the card hang in the air between us. "Or," he continued, "you can stay. You can trade that borrowed dress for a seat at a table where no one will ever dare to touch your hair again. You won't be a ghost. You'll be the hand that moves the pieces." I looked at the card, then up at the man who had turned a public assault into a strategic move. He wasn't offering me a fairy tale. He was offering me power as a form of protection. He was telling me that the only way to stop being a victim was to become part of the machinery that created them. The silence of the library was absolute, a stark contrast to the scream I had suppressed in the ballroom. I thought about the bus ticket. I thought about the changing phone numbers and the barricaded doors of my past. I thought about the way the light had died in Cauldron's eyes when Hale stood up. I reached out. My fingers brushed his as I took the card. It was cold, heavy, and felt like a key. "I don't even know what you really do," I whispered. Hale Jin-woo finally allowed a small, sharp glint of a smile to touch the corners of his mouth. He leaned down, his face close to mine, his scent of cedar and ozone filling my senses. "I end the problems, Ryla," he said. "And starting tomorrow, so do you." Chapter 4. The morning sun in Palm Springs was a brutal, unforgiving white, bleaching the desert landscape and reflecting off the polished glass of the hotel's administrative wing. I walked through the service entrance, not in the borrowed silk gown of the night before, but in my standard issue black slacks and a button-down shirt that felt like a suit of armor. My scalp still felt tight, a lingering ghost of the trauma, but the black card Hale Jin-woo had given me was tucked into my pocket, its weight pressing against my hip like a secret. I expected the air to be thick with the scandal of the previous night. I expected whispers in the hallway and the judging stares of the permanent staff. Instead, I walked into a vacuum. I stopped at the main office to check the digital roster for the week's events. My manager, a man named Marcus, who usually spent his mornings barking about tray placement and unpolished silver, didn't even look up from his tablet. He looked hollow, the skin beneath his eyes sagging as if he'd spent the night watching his own world crumble. "Marcus," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt, "am I still on for the donor luncheon?" He finally looked at me, and for the first time in 6 months of working under him, he didn't see a temporary hire. He saw the girl from the foyer. He saw the girl who had stood beside Hale Jin-woo. He flinched, a small, involuntary jerk of his shoulder. "The luncheon is still on," he muttered, his voice raspy. "But the guest list has been revised." He turned the tablet toward me. At the top of the removed column, the name Cauldron Voss glared back in red pixels. It wasn't just a cancellation. Beneath it, a series of automated notifications were scrolling by in real time. Voss Holdings, sponsorship terminated. Voss, C, board member status, revoked. Voss, C, access credentials, deactivated. It was a systematic erasure. I watched, as a clerk in the background began peeling a gold-embossed nameplate off a donor recognition wall near the lobby. The name on the plate was Cauldron's. The man had spent years and millions of dollars to cement his legacy in this valley, and in less than 12 hours, he was being treated like a stain that wouldn't come out without a heavy chemical scrub. "He's gone, Ryla," Marcus whispered, leaning in as if the walls were listening. "The board held an emergency session at 3 this morning. They didn't even put it to a vote. It was a directive, from the top. Someone, I don't know who, but someone with a hell of a lot of reach, sent a file to every major stakeholder in the city. Bankruptcy filings, old litigation, things that were supposed to be buried in offshore vaults. By sunrise, Cauldron Voss was toxic. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I knew exactly who had sent that file. Hale hadn't just stopped the assault, he had dismantled the man behind it. He had unbuttoned his jacket, and the world had responded by swallowing Cauldron whole. I left the office and walked toward the staff lounge, passing the gallery where the gala had been held. The double doors to the library were closed, but I couldn't help but stare at them. I remembered the scent of cedar and ozone. I remembered the way Hale had said he ended problems. As I reached the lockers, I saw a group of the elite catering staff, the ones who had turned their backs while I was being dragged by my hair. They were huddled together, but as I approached, the group fractured. They didn't mock me. They didn't whisper. They stepped aside, clearing a path for me with a frantic, desperate kind of politeness. They were terrified that even a stray look might be interpreted as a slight by the man who was currently burning Cauldron Voss's empire to the ground. I reached into my locker and pulled out my phone. There was one new message from an unknown number. "The names are being removed so you never have to see them again. A car is waiting for you at the west gate. Your shift is over." I looked at the black card in my hand. The gold knot seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights of the lounge. Hale hadn't just cleared the path for me to walk. He had removed the very obstacles I had spent years trying to navigate. Cauldron wasn't just a man who had touched my hair. He was the symbol of every entitlement and every violation I had ever endured. And now, he was a ghost. I didn't change out of my uniform. I didn't say goodbye to Marcus. I walked out of the hotel, through the kitchen and out the west gate. A sleek black sedan was idling at the curb, its windows tinted so dark they looked like ink. The driver stepped out, a man with a military posture and a neutral expression. He didn't ask for my name. He simply opened the rear door and waited. I looked back at the hotel one last time. I saw the maintenance crew on the roof, taking down a large banner for the Voss Charity Foundation. The letters were being folded up, tucked away into unmarked boxes, hidden from the desert sun. Cauldron's connections hadn't just vanished. They had been retracted into the shadows, leaving no trace that he had ever owned a single square inch of this city. I sat in the back of the car, the leather cool against my skin. As we pulled away from the curb, the silence of the vehicle felt like the silence of the library. I realized that the vanished connections weren't just about Cauldron. My own connection to my old life, to the fear, the hiding, and the desperation, was being scrubbed away too. Hail Jin-woo hadn't just given me an invitation. He had given me a clean slate, and he had signed it in the blood of his enemies' reputations. As the car accelerated toward the mountains, I felt the weight of the black card in my hand, and knew that the woman who had entered that hotel yesterday was as gone as the name on the donor wall. Chapter 5. The car didn't take me to a warehouse, or a dimly lit basement, but to a glass and steel monolith rising out of the desert scrub like a jagged crystal. This was the headquarters of Jin-woo Global Logistics, a name I had seen on shipping containers at the port, but had never associated with the man who had unbuttoned his jacket in a ballroom. Hale was waiting for me on the top floor. The office was vast, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the shimmering heat haze of the Coachella Valley. He had changed into a charcoal suit, but he still wore that same air of absolute, terrifying composure. "The car was comfortable, I hope," he said, not looking up from a series of monitors displaying real-time shipping routes across the Pacific. "It was," I replied, standing in the center of the plush rug. "But I'm still waiting for the other shoe to drop. People like Cauldron Voss don't just disappear without a vacuum being created. And vacuums get filled by people even worse than them." Hale finally turned, leaning back against his desk. "You're learning. Most people would be celebrating their rescue. You're already looking for the next threat. That is why you're here." He walked to a side table and picked up a heavy leather folder, tossing it onto a low glass table. In front of me, I opened it. Inside were photographs, legal documents, and a series of digital transcripts. My name was everywhere, but so was Cauldron's. It was a dossier on the night before, and the years leading up to it. "Your safety," Hale said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant vibration, "is no longer a matter of luck or how well you can hide behind a locked door. It has become a matter of my personal infrastructure. In this city, and in several others, there are lines that people know not to cross. Political lines, financial lines, bloodlines. As of last night, you are one of those lines. I don't want to be a line in the sand," I said, looking him in the eye. "I want to be the person holding the shovel." Hale's expression shifted, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good, because I'm not offering you a pension or a bodyguard. I'm offering you a seat in the room where the decisions are made. My logistics network handles more than just freight, Ryla. We move information. We move influence. We move the things that make men like Cauldron Voss possible. And we can just as easily move the things that make them impossible." He walked to the window, gesturing to the sprawling valley below. "I need someone who understands the view from the bottom. Someone who knows how to spot a predator before he even enters the room, because they've spent their life being hunted. I want you to manage the discretion side of our local acquisitions. You'll be the one who ensures that our partners remain as civil as they claim to be." I looked down at the folder. It was more than a job. It was an invitation to join the machinery of power. I thought about the 3 months I had spent sleeping with a chair wedged under my door handle. I thought about the way the people at the gala had looked away while I screamed. "And if Cauldron comes back?" I asked. Hale turned back to me, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Cauldron Voss is currently being processed for several federal violations that he didn't even know he had committed until my legal team pointed them out to the right people. But if he or anyone else so much as thinks about your name with malice, they will find that the line has already been crossed. And I do not negotiate with people who cross my lines." He walked over and stood so close, I could smell the faint, sharp scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and cold iron. He reached out, his hand hovering near my shoulder, a gesture of protection that felt like a coronation. "You are under my wing now, Ryla. Not because you're a victim who needs a cage, but because you are a weapon I am finally unsheathing. Do you accept?" I looked at the valley, then at the man who had dismantled a mogul with a single gesture of his hand. I reached out and shook his hand. It was firm, cool, and felt like the closing of a vault door. "I accept," I whispered. The world outside was still hot and bright, but for the first time in my life, the shadows felt like they belonged to me. I wasn't running anymore. I was part of the storm. Chapter 6. The transition from a service uniform to the sleek, tailored minimalist wardrobe provided by Hale's staff felt like shedding a skin that had never quite fit. My new office at the monolith was quiet, but it was the silence of a high-functioning machine, not the hollow quiet of the hiding spots I had occupied for the last 3 months. I spent the morning reviewing the discretion protocols for the Palm Springs district, but my mind kept drifting back to the library, to the scent of ozone, and to the terrifyingly precise way Hale had intervened. A chime sounded at my desk, and the heavy frosted glass door slid open. Hale didn't wait for an invitation. He walked in with a tablet in hand, his presence immediately pulling the oxygen from the room. He looked at the dossiers spread across my desk, his eyes scanning them with a speed that suggested he already knew every word on the pages. "You're adjusting quickly," he noted, his voice a calm vibration. "But you're still looking for the catch. You think this was a lucky break, a coincidence of timing." "Wasn't it?" I asked, leaning back. "You were at the gala. Cauldron was a fool. You saw an opening, and took it. And that's how people like you operate, isn't it?" Hale set the tablet on the desk and slid it toward me. "I don't believe in openings that I haven't already measured. Look at the timestamps, Ryla." I pulled the tablet closer. It wasn't a business ledger or a shipping manifest. It was a surveillance log. I scrolled through the entries, my heart skipping a beat as the dates scrolled back. 2 weeks ago. A month ago. 3 months ago. The exact week I had arrived in California with nothing but a bruised ego and a desire to disappear. There were photos, me at the bus station, me entering the small, cramped apartment I'd shared with 2 other girls, me walking into the catering agency to apply for the temporary pool. In every shot, there was a red timestamp and a brief, clinical note on my movements. Subject remains guarded. Avoids high-traffic areas. Exhibits high situational awareness. "You've been stalking me," I whispered, the old fear. The one Cauldron had briefly revived, surging back into my throat. "I've been evaluating you," Hale corrected, his voice devoid of apology. "There is a difference. Stalking is an obsession of the weak. Evaluation is the due diligence of the powerful. I needed a specific kind of operative for the Coachella corridor. Someone who wasn't tied to the local old money families. Someone who knew how to stay quiet because they had spent their life surviving. I didn't find you at the gala, Ryla. I put you there." I looked at a photo taken 4 nights before the party. It was a long-range shot of me at a diner, staring out the window at the rain. I looked tired, small and utterly alone. "The catering agency," I said, the pieces clicking together with a sickening metallic snap. "The accidental opening for the gala staff. The borrowed dress that was delivered to my locker by a stranger. You staged the whole thing." "I provided the stage," Hale said, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window. Cauldron provided the conflict. I knew his temperament. I knew he was looking for someone to dominate, to prove his standing to the investors. I didn't know he would grab your hair, but I knew he would cross a line. I was waiting for him to do it. I needed a public reason to dismantle his holdings without triggering a war with his partners. He gave me that reason, and you gave me the proof that you were exactly who I thought you were. I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You used me as bait." Hale turned back, his expression unreadable, though his eyes were as dark as the deep Pacific. "I used you as a catalyst. There is a difference. If you had crumbled, if you had begged him for mercy, or played the victim to the crowd, I still would have stopped him, but you wouldn't be sitting in this office today. You would have been given a severance check and a ticket out of the state." He stepped closer, invading my space with that same controlled gravity. "But you didn't crumble. You stood your ground in a room full of people who wanted you to disappear. You showed me that you weren't just a survivor. You were a survivor who was tired of running." That was the final evaluation. I looked at the tablet again, at the months of my life documented in grainy black and white. It was a violation, yes, but it was also a revelation. For 3 months I had thought I was alone, vulnerable, and one mistake away from being caught by my past. Instead, I had been under the gaze of a man who was treating my struggle like a job interview. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "There are thousands of people who could do this job. People with training, people who aren't broken. People who aren't broken don't see the cracks in the world," Hale said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. "And my business is built in those cracks. I don't need a soldier who follows orders because they were told to. I need someone who follows them because they know what happens to the world when the wrong person is in charge. I chose you because you have the one thing money can't buy, an absolute bone-deep refusal to be owned again." He reached out and tapped the screen, closing the surveillance log. The black card I had taken from him was sitting on my desk, the gold knot gleaming. "The evaluation is over, Ryla," he said. "The question is no longer whether you are capable. The question is whether you are ready to stop being the subject of the story and start being the author." I looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't a savior. He was a man who saw the world as a series of assets and liabilities, and he had decided I was his greatest asset. It was cold, it was calculated, and for the first time in my life it felt like the only version of the truth I could trust. "What's the first assignment?" I asked. Hale's mouth curved into that sharp, fleeting glint of a smile. He didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked toward the door, knowing I was already 2 steps behind him. Chapter 7. The collapse of an empire sounds less like a crash, and more like a series of quiet, clinical snips. Over the next 72 hours, I watched from behind the glass of the Jin-woo monolith, as Cauldron Voss was disassembled. It started with his credit lines being frozen, followed by the discovery of structural irregularities in his flagship Palm Springs developments. By the 3rd day, the man who had thought he owned the air I breathed couldn't even get a table at the diners he used to patronize. But desperation is a volatile fuel. I was leaving the office late, the desert sky a bruised purple, when the first strike landed. I wasn't in the back of a black sedan this time. I was walking toward the parking structure, testing the boundaries of my new safety. I needed to know if the line Hale spoke of was real, or if I was simply a bird in a more expensive cage. The headlights flickered to life behind me, twin predatory eyes cutting through the gloom of the concrete tiers. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I turned slowly, my hand slipping into my pocket to touch the heavy weight of the black card Hale had given me. The car was a battered domestic sedan, a far cry from the luxury vehicles Cauldron usually drove. It screeched to a halt 10 feet away, and Cauldron Voss stumbled out. He looked like a man who had been dragged through the very desert scrub he used to look down on. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie was gone, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild with the frantic energy of a man who has lost everything and has only one person left to blame. "You," he hissed, the word a spray of venom. "You did this. You and that ghost you're sleeping with." "I did nothing, Cauldron," I said, my voice sounding incredibly loud in the hollow garage. "You grabbed a woman's hair in a room full of people who were tired of pretending you mattered. You ended yourself. I had friends. I had contracts." He took a lurching step toward me, his hand reaching out as if to repeat the violation from the gala. "I'm going to take you with me. If I'm going down, I'm going to make sure Hale Jinro knows what it feels like to lose something he thinks he owns." He didn't see the movement in the shadows behind him. I did. 2 men in charcoal suits stepped out from behind the concrete pillars. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. They moved with the same terrifyingly synchronized efficiency I had come to associate with everything Hale touched. One of them caught Cauldron's arm mid-swing, twisting it behind his back with a sickening pop. The other simply stood in front of him, a silent wall of muscle and professional indifference. Cauldron screamed, a high, thin sound of shock, but it was cut short as he was pressed against the side of his own car. "Let him go." The voice came from the stairwell. Hale stepped into the light, his hands in his pockets, his coat open as always. He looked at Cauldron not with anger, but with a weary kind of disappointment, as if he were looking at a broken piece of equipment that refused to be recycled. "Hale, tell them," Cauldron gasped, his face pressed against the hot metal of the hood. "Tell them who I am." Hale walked over, stopping inches from Cauldron's face. "I know exactly who you are, Cauldron. You are a man who mistook proximity for power. You thought because you sat at the same tables as me, you were made of the same salt. You aren't." Hale looked at me, then back to the broken man. "I told you to leave. I gave you the mercy of a graceful exit. But you decided to come back for a girl you thought was small. That was your final mistake." Hale turned to the man holding Cauldron. "He's been trying to move liquidated assets to a shell company in Nevada. Give the files to the DA's office. All of them. And make sure the press knows which motel he's been hiding in. If he wants to be noticed, let's make sure everyone sees him." The guards dragged Cauldron toward the car, and I watched as the man who had once commanded a room was folded into the back seat like a common criminal. The first strike of his retaliation hadn't even lasted 60 seconds. It wasn't a fight, it was an eviction. Hale walked over to me. He didn't ask if I was scared. He looked at my hand, which was still steady. "The line held," he said simply. "It did," I replied. "But he was right about one thing. He thought you owned me. That's why he came here. He wanted to break something of yours." Hale's eyes darkened, the amber light of the garage reflecting in them like a controlled fire. "He was wrong. I don't own you, Ryla. I protect you because you are part of the firm. But more importantly, I protect you because I want to see what you'll do once you realize you don't need me to." He gestured toward his car. "Come. There is a meeting in the valley tonight with the people who used to bankroll Cauldron. They're nervous. They need to see who is taking over his accounts." "Me?" I asked. "You," Hale said. "They need to see the woman who ended Cauldron Voss. It's time they learned a new name." As we drove out of the garage, I saw Cauldron's battered car being towed away in the rearview mirror. The first strike was over. The counterattack was beginning. And for the first time, I wasn't just watching the fire, I was the one holding the match. Chapter 8. The meeting wasn't held in a boardroom, but in a private terminal at the edge of the Palm Springs airport, where the wind whipped the desert sand against reinforced glass. Outside, 3 white cargo planes sat with their engines idling, the low-frequency hum vibrating through the floor and into the soles of my shoes. Hale stood by a long steel table littered with digital tablets and physical manifests. He hadn't put his jacket back on since the garage. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms that looked carved from granite. He gestured for me to stand beside him as 4 men entered the room. These weren't thugs or street-level enforcers. They were the quiet power, the heads of the valley's water district, the lead contractors for the desert's sprawling solar farms, and the men who controlled the flow of every luxury import that entered the local resorts. They looked at me with a mixture of terror and intense, clinical curiosity. They saw the woman who had caused Cauldron Voss to be erased, and they were trying to calculate if I was a liability or a new variable they had to solve. Cauldron thought power was a bank balance, Hale said, his voice cutting through the hum of the planes. He didn't look at the men, he looked at the monitors. He thought if he threw enough money at a problem, or a woman, it would bend. He was a consumer. He bought things he didn't understand. Hale tapped a command on his tablet, and the wall behind him flickered to life. It wasn't a map of the city's streets, but a glowing web of data points, freight schedules, electrical grids, and the real-time movement of every shipping container currently crossing the state line. I don't buy things, Hale continued, finally turning to face the 4 men. I control the movement of things. That is the difference between wealth and authority. Money can be frozen, money can be devalued, but a city that cannot move its water, its power, or its luxury goods, is a city that ceases to exist. I own the movement, and as of tonight, Ryla owns the keys. One of the men, a silver-haired contractor who had been a silent partner in Cauldron's developments, cleared his throat. Hale, we've worked with Voss for years. His collapse is going to cause a ripple in the supply chain. We have deadlines. We have commitments. You had a liability, Hale corrected, stepping toward the man. Cauldron was sloppy. He spent his time grabbing hair in ballrooms while his logistics were leaking money. Ryla has already identified 3 points in your infrastructure where you were being skimmed. Show them. I stepped forward, the weight of the black card in my pocket giving me a strange, cold confidence. I didn't feel like the girl who had been hiding in a cramped apartment. I felt like the architect of the storm. I tapped the screen, highlighting a series of red zones in the northern corridor. Cauldron was using your solar farm shipments as cover for his own private acquisitions, I said, my voice steady and sharp. He was slowing down your timelines to inflate his own margins. I've rerouted the freight through Jin-woo Global's private hub. Your deadlines will be met 2 days early, but the contract doesn't go back to Voss Holdings. It stays with us. The room went silent. The silver-haired man looked at the data, then at me, then at Hale. He realized that the discretion Hale had mentioned wasn't just about keeping secrets. It was about the absolute, surgical control of the valley's lifeblood. They weren't just looking at a new manager. They were looking at the person who could shut off their world with a single keystroke. Information is the only thing that doesn't depreciate, Hale said, placing a hand on the back of my chair. It was a claim, a statement of fact, that silenced any remaining doubt in the room. Cauldron Voss thought he was a player. He was just a passenger. Ryla is the one driving now. The men nodded, quickly, frantically, and began to sign the digital documents I presented. They weren't just signing contracts, they were pledging fealty to a new hierarchy. When they finally filed out of the terminal, the silence that returned was different. It was heavy with the realization of what we had just done. I looked up at the glowing map, at the thousands of lines crossing and recrossing the desert. You don't just move boxes, do you? I asked softly. Boxes are just the containers for the power, Hale replied. He walked over to the glass, watching the cargo planes begin to taxi toward the runway. The city thinks it runs on tourism and sunshine. It actually runs on the things I allow to enter it. And now, it runs on you. He turned to me, the amber runway lights reflecting in his eyes. For a moment, the coldness of the logistics boss vanished, replaced by a dark, intense approval. They're afraid of you, Ryla. Not because of me, but because they saw how easily you found the cracks in their lives. You're not a ghost anymore. You're the shadow that keeps the lights on. I looked at my hands. They were steady. The fear that had defined my life for 3 months was gone, replaced by a sharp, jagged sense of purpose. I wasn't just safe. I was essential. I was the line that no one crossed, and I was the logistics of the power itself. What's next? I asked. Hale reached out and finally rebuttoned his jacket, the ritual of restraint returning as the business of the night concluded. Next, we find out what happens when the rest of the world realizes the line has moved. Chapter 9. The air at the mid-century estate was thick, with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, and the low, electric hum of an event that didn't exist on any public calendar. This was a private gathering of the valley's new guard, Hale's Guard. The atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the charity gala where this had all begun. Here, there was no performative laughter, no desperate social climbing. There was only the quiet, heavy precision of real power. I stood on the terrace, overlooking a pool that glowed like a sapphire embedded in the desert floor. I was no longer wearing a borrowed dress. I wore a tailored suit of deep midnight blue, the fabric, a subtle armor that moved with me. In my hand, I held a glass of mineral water, my eyes constantly scanning the perimeter. Hale had taught me that the moment you stop looking for the cracks is the moment the structure collapses. "You're standing in the light, Ryla," Hale's voice came from the shadows behind me. He stepped forward, his silhouette cutting through the amber glow of the house. "A predator looks for the silhouette. Move back into the shade." "I'm not hiding anymore, Hale," I said, though I took a step back nonetheless. "The logistics are tight, the guests are vetted. The line is secure." "The line is only as secure as the desperation of the man trying to cross it," he replied. As if summoned by the mention of desperation, a disturbance erupted at the front gates. It wasn't the sound of an explosion, but the screech of tires, and the high-pitched, hysterical shouting of a man who had lost his mind along with his dignity. Security didn't immediately move to crush him, they waited for the signal. Hale didn't give it. He wanted to see. A battered vehicle smashed through the ornamental shrubbery, skidding to a halt just yards from the terrace. Cauldron Voss stumbled out. He looked like a ghost of the man he had been. His eyes were sunken, his skin a sallow gray, and his hands shook with a rhythmic, violent tremor. He wasn't armed with a gun. He was armed with a folder of physical papers, clutching them to his chest like a holy relic. "Hale!" Cauldron screamed, his voice cracking and echoing off the canyon walls. "I know what you did. I have the original deeds. You can't just move the borders. This land, these people, they belong to the Voss name for 40 years. The guests on the terrace didn't run. They simply stopped, watching with a detached, clinical interest, as old money attempted to scream its way back into relevance. Hale stepped to the edge of the stone stairs, his hand moving to the top button of his jacket. He didn't unbutton it yet. He simply stood there, a pillar of absolute authority. "Cauldron, you're trespassing on a reality you no longer inhabit. You think you're a god because you move some containers." Cauldron lunged forward, his feet tripping over the manicured grass. "My father built this valley. We laid the pipes. We signed the charters. You're just a ghost in a suit." Cauldron's eyes shifted to me, and the hatred there was so pure it felt like a physical heat. "And you're the reason. You whispered in his ear, didn't you? You told him where the cracks were. You're a traitor to the very people who let you serve them." I walked down the first 2 steps, standing just behind Hale's shoulder. "No one let me do anything, Cauldron. You took what you wanted until there was nothing left to take." I didn't whisper in his ear. I showed him the ledgers you were too arrogant to hide. "You're a servant." Cauldron shrieked, throwing the folder into the air. The papers scattered like dead leaves, floating into the pool. "You're a nothing. I should have finished it at the gala. I should have." He made the mistake of lunging toward the stairs. In a move so fast it seemed to skip a frame of reality, Hale stepped down. He didn't strike Cauldron. He simply placed a hand on the man's chest, a gesture of such immense, immovable force, that Cauldron stopped dead. Then, Hale's fingers moved to his jacket. He unbuttoned it slowly. The click of the button, the only sound in the desert night. "The charters your father signed are paper, Cauldron," Hale said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. "Paper burns, paper rots. Authority is what happens when a man stands in a room, and no one dares to tell him no. You lost that right the moment you thought your name was a shield for your cowardice." Hale leaned in closer, his shadow swallowing Cauldron whole. "You breached my boundary. You came to my home. You threatened my people. The old world is dead, Cauldron, and I am the one who buried it." Hale didn't have to signal his security. 2 men appeared from the darkness, catching Cauldron by the elbows. He didn't fight them this time. He looked at the papers floating in the pool, turning into soggy, illegible pulp, and he began to sob, a dry, hollow sound that signaled the final breaking of his spirit. "Take him to the edge of the property," Hale said, turning his back on the man, "and remind the police that Mr. Voss is a danger to himself. He needs a quiet place to think about the past. A very quiet, very secure place." As they dragged Cauldron away, the silence returned to the estate. The guests began to murmur again, the music resumed, and the transition of power was finalized. It wasn't a war. It was an execution of an obsolete idea. Hale stood on the stairs, his jacket open, his eyes fixed on the desert horizon. I walked down to stand beside him, looking at the pool where the last of the Voss legacy was sinking to the bottom. He was right about one thing, I said softly. The deeds were real. The deeds were history, Hale replied, finally looking at me. And history is just the story the losers tell themselves. The future is what we move tomorrow. He reached out and rested his hand on my shoulder, not a claim of ownership, but a recognition of a peer. I realized then that the boundary wasn't just around the house or the business. The boundary was around us, and it was unbreakable. Chapter 10. The following morning, the desert was unnervingly quiet. Cauldron Voss was gone, but the echo of his presence remained like a foul residue on the city. Hale didn't wait for the gossip to settle. He understood that a vacuum in power is an invitation for chaos, and he intended to seal that vacuum personally. We arrived at the downtown district's most exclusive private club, a place where the real decisions of Palm Springs were made behind frosted glass and mahogany. This wasn't a party. It was a summit. The men who had previously hedged their bets, waiting to see if Cauldron would somehow claw his way back to relevance, were all gathered in the lounge. They sat in low leather chairs, nursing stiff drinks, their eyes darting to the door every time it swung open. When Hale entered, he didn't head for the bar. He walked straight to the center of the room, and I walked beside him. The silence that fell was different from the one at the gala. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, born of the knowledge that the man in front of them had just erased a multimillionaire overnight. Hale scanned the room, his expression as unreadable as a desert horizon. He didn't look like a man who had won a war. He looked like a man who was closing a ledger. Last night, Hale began, his voice low and vibrating with a frequency that seemed to hum in the glassware. A boundary was crossed. Not just a boundary of property, but a boundary of respect. Cauldron Voss believed that wealth granted him the right to touch what he did not own, and to threaten what he did not build. One of the senior investors, a man who had known Cauldron for 30 years, shifted in his seat. Hale, we understand the sentiment, but the market needs stability. You've paralyzed the development sector. We need to know where we stand. Hale didn't answer with words. He looked at me, a silent cue. I stepped forward, opening the tablet I carried. The development sector isn't paralyzed, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. It's been audited. The Voss contracts have been absorbed into Jin-woo Global. If you want to keep your projects on schedule, you will sign the new terms. If you prefer to stay loyal to a ghost, you can follow him into the desert. The senior investor looked at me, then at Hale, his jaw tightening. You're asking us to hand over our autonomy to her, to a girl who was serving drinks a week ago? The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I felt the air shift as Hale took a single step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply reached for the top button of his jacket. He unbuttoned it. Then the second. Then the third. He pulled the jacket back, revealing the holster tucked against his ribs, but more importantly, he revealed the absolute lack of fear in his posture. The signal of the unbuttoned jacket, the one that had started as a warning at the gala, was now fully realized. It was no longer a hint of violence. It was the promise of it. It was the physical manifestation of a man who had stripped away the polite veneer of the businessman to show the predator that lived beneath. You are mistaken, Hale said, his voice a cold, sharp blade. I am not asking you to do anything. I am telling you how the world works now. Ryla is not the help. She is the authority. And when I unbutton my jacket, it is because I am tired of the pretense that we are all equals in this room. He walked toward the senior investor, the open jacket flaring like the wings of a dark bird. He leaned down, his face inches from the older man's. You have 10 seconds to decide if you want to be part of the future, or a footnote in the past. If you speak to her with anything less than the respect you owe me, you won't just lose your contracts. You will lose the right to walk into this room. The investor's bravado vanished. He looked at Hale's open jacket, at the cold iron of his gaze, and then he looked at me. He saw the truth that Cauldron had missed. I wasn't Hale's pet or his project. I was his partner. I was the one who had the data, the logistics, and the absolute backing of the most dangerous man in the state. I apologize, the investor stammered, his eyes fixed on the floor. The terms are acceptable. The rest of the men in the room followed suit, their signatures appearing on my tablet in a frantic, digital scramble. The message was finalized. The threat of the unbuttoned jacket wasn't about a single assault anymore. It was about the total, unconditional surrender of the old guard. Hale didn't rebutton his jacket. He turned to me, his eyes softening for the briefest of moments, a flicker of dark pride shining through. They understand now, he said quietly. They do, I replied, looking around at the room of broken men. But I think I liked it better when they were laughing. It made it easier to know who to move against first. Hale let out a short, dry laugh, the first time I had ever heard him do so. You're learning faster than I anticipated, Ryla. The signal isn't just for them. It's for us. It means we no longer have to pretend. We walked out of the club, leaving the elite to whisper in the shadows of their own making. As we stepped into the bright, white heat of the Palm Springs sun, Hale finally reached up and fastened a single button. The mask was back on, but the world knew what lived underneath. The line had been drawn, the message had been delivered, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the storm to break. I was the storm. Chapter 11. The dust of the transition had settled, but the atmosphere in Palm Springs had changed permanently. It was a dry, heavy heat that carried the scent of ozone, and the quiet vibration of a machine that was finally running in perfect alignment. I stood in the lobby of the Art Deco hotel where it had all begun, but the woman who had walked through the service entrance 2 weeks ago was a ghost I no longer recognized. I wasn't wearing a borrowed dress. I was draped in a tailored charcoal suit that moved with the fluidity of silk but carried the weight of a uniform. I wasn't carrying a tray of empty flutes. I was carrying a leather-bound portfolio that contained the signed concessions of every major developer in the Coachella Valley. As I crossed the marble floor, the shift in the room was instantaneous and visceral. The bellhops, who used to look through me as if I were part of the architecture, snapped to attention, their eyes fixed on a point just above my shoulder. The concierge, a man who had once ignored my request for a spare key to the staff locker, practically tripped over himself to open the heavy brass doors for me. "Good afternoon, Ms. Mercer," he said, his voice pitched at a level of reverence usually reserved for royalty or federal judges. "Mr. Jin-woo is expecting you in the penthouse lounge." "Thank you, Elias," I said, using his name for the first time. He flinched slightly at the recognition, a small sign of how much the power dynamic had inverted. I didn't head for the service elevator. I walked straight to the private lift, the one that required a biometric scan and a level of clearance that Cauldron Voss had spent 20 years trying to acquire. I pressed my thumb to the glass, and the doors slid open with a hushed, expensive sigh. Inside the lift, I caught my reflection in the polished brass. My eyes were the same umber, but the steady, guarded look they once held had sharpened into something more lethal, something calculating. I wasn't just safe, I was significant. I was the person whose name was whispered in the backrooms of the city's most exclusive clubs, the woman who had survived a monster and been claimed by a king. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. Hale was standing by the glass, looking out over the desert mountains as the sun began to dip behind the San Jacinto Peak. He didn't turn around immediately. He didn't have to. He knew my stride, the rhythm of my presence. "The meeting at the club went well," I said, setting the portfolio on the low marble table. "The senior investors have stopped asking about my resume. They've started asking for my approval." Hale turned, his jacket unbuttoned, his stance relaxed in a way that only a man with absolute control can afford to be. He looked at me, and for a moment, the business of the logistics network felt miles away. "They didn't have a choice, Ryla," he said, his voice a low melodic rumble. "In this city there are two types of people, those who serve and those who are served. You spent too long in the first category. The second category is much smaller, and much more protective of its own." "I saw Marcus today," I said, referring to my old catering manager. "He tried to apologize for the night of the gala. He looked like he was expecting me to fire him on the spot." "And did you?" "No," I replied, walking over to the window to stand beside him. Firing him would have been an admission that I still cared about what happened that night. I told him to make sure the silver was polished for next month's summit. I told him I'd be checking. Hale let out a soft, dark chuckle. "A more effective punishment. You've given him a reason to fear your return, every single day." He reached out and placed a hand on the small of my back, a light, steady pressure that felt like the closing of a circuit. I realized in that moment that the temporary staff girl was truly dead. I was the most protected person in Palm Springs not because I had bodyguards or armored cars, but because I had become an extension of Hale Jin-woo himself. To touch me was to touch him. To disrespect me was to invite the total erasure of one's existence. "Cauldron's name was removed from the hospital wing this morning," Hale noted, his eyes tracking a private jet as it ascended from the airport. "They're replacing the plaque. I suggest they leave it blank for now. I thought you might have a preference for what goes there." I looked at him, surprised by the offering. "You're giving me the naming rights?" "I'm giving you the city's memory," Hale said. "You were the catalyst for the change. It's only fitting that you decide what remains of the old guard." I looked out at the valley, at the sprawling grid of lights beginning to twinkle in the twilight. I thought about the months of hiding, the fear of footsteps in the hall, and the feeling of fingers knotted in my hair. That version of Ryla Mercer was a world away. Here on the top floor of the monolith, the air was clear, and the view was infinite. "Leave it blank," I said finally. "Let them wonder who owns the space. The mystery is more effective than the name." Hale's eyes shone with a cold, bright approval. "A perfect choice. It reminds them that the hierarchy has changed, but the new ruler doesn't need to shout to be felt." As the desert sky turned a deep, bruised violet, I felt the weight of my new life. It wasn't a burden, it was a cloak. I was no longer the girl running from the storm. I was the one who decided when the lightning struck. I was the new hierarchy, and the city was finally quiet. Chapter 12. The Art Deco hotel looked exactly as it had 2 weeks ago, its gilded facade shimmering under the desert stars, but the air felt entirely different as the black sedan pulled up to the main entrance. The last time I had arrived here, I had taken the service bus, clutching a bag with a borrowed dress, and a heart full of desperate hope that I could remain invisible. Tonight the valet opened the door before the car had even fully settled, and the silence that greeted my arrival was one of profound, breathless anticipation. Hale stepped out first, offering his hand. As my fingers met his, I felt the steady, cool strength that had become my anchor. I wore a gown of deep emerald silk that caught the light like a gemstone, tailored so perfectly it felt less like clothing, and more like a second skin. My hair, which had once been a handle for a man's cruelty, was styled in an elegant, intricate sweep that bared my neck and shoulders. I wasn't hiding the marks of the past. I was transcending them. We didn't enter through the side doors. We walked through the grand foyer, our footsteps echoing on the marble that had once felt so cold and indifferent. As we reached the threshold of the ballroom, the transition was instantaneous. 2 weeks ago, I was the help, a ghost in the periphery. Now as the double doors swung open, the music didn't stop, but the energy of the room shifted toward us like a tide. Conversations didn't die out of fear this time. They died out of respect. People didn't look away. They didn't dare to. They watched us with a rapt, intense focus, recognizing that the hierarchy they had spent their lives climbing had been fundamentally restructured. We moved through the crowd, and I felt the weight of 1,000 stares. I saw the woman in the silver gown who had once ignored my pleas for help. Tonight, she dipped her head in a shallow, nervous bow as we passed. I saw the men who had laughed with Cauldron. They stood straighter now, their expressions carefully neutral, their hands gripping their glasses with white-knuckled intensity. Hale led me to the center of the room, the very spot where the marble staircase met the floor. It was the exact coordinate where Cauldron had knotted his fist in my hair. I stood there, my head held high, looking out at the sea of elite power brokers. I felt no phantom pain, no lingering humiliation. I only felt the absolute, unwavering presence of the man beside me. Hale didn't need to unbutton his jacket tonight. He stood with his hand resting lightly on my waist, a gesture of public claim that was louder than any shout. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on a few individuals until they looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Then, he looked at me, and for the first time in that public space he allowed a look of genuine dark pride to soften his features. "You aren't a guest tonight, Ryla," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those closest to us. "And you aren't under my protection. You are with me." The room understood the distinction. I wasn't a victim he had saved. I was the partner he had chosen. I was the one who held the data, the one who understood the logistics of their lives, and the one who had the ear of the most dangerous man in California. A waiter approached us with a tray of champagne. He was young, his hands shaking slightly as he offered the crystal flutes. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same flicker of invisible fear I had carried for years. I took a glass and gave him a small, steady nod. "Thank you," I said. The waiter blinked, a look of profound relief crossing his face as he realized I had actually seen him. He retreated into the crowd, and I turned back to Hale. "They're all waiting for a signal," I whispered, gesturing to the silent, watchful crowd. "They want to know if the rules have changed." "The rules haven't changed, Ryla," Hale replied, raising his glass in a subtle, sharp toast to the room. "They've simply been enforced. They know now that the line is permanent, and they know who holds the pen." As we began to move through the room again, people stepped aside with a grace that bordered on the ceremonial. I spoke to the investors, I discussed the new logistics manifests, and I accepted the apologies of men who had once thought I was beneath their notice. I didn't do it with spite, I did it with the clinical detached authority that Hale had taught me. By the time we reached the balcony doors, the moon was high over the desert. I stepped out into the cool night air, looking back at the glittering golden cage of the ballroom. For the first time in my life I didn't feel like I was on the outside looking in, or the inside looking for an exit. I was exactly where I was meant to be. Hale joined me at the railing, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the stars. "Are you ready for what comes next?" he asked. Cauldron was just the first brick. There are others who will try to test the new borders. I looked at the black card in my evening bag, then back at the man who had seen the weapon inside the victim. "Let them come," I said, my voice as steady as the desert mountains. "I'm tired of running. I think I'd rather see what happens when the rest of the world realizes that the line they aren't supposed to cross is me." Hale didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took my hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles that no longer shook. In the silence of the desert night, the message was finalized. The hierarchy was set, and as we walked back into the light of the gala, not a single person looked away. If this story resonated with you, the tension between honesty and survival, the transformation of power through restraint, the way innocence can become strategic armor, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below sharing what stood out most to you. Was it Aveline's unflinching transparency? Rourke's shift from possession to protection? The way truth became untouchable in a world of lies? And if you want more stories that explore complex power dynamics, psychological tension, and characters who redefine what strength actually means, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's much more to come. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.